When it comes to British aircraft carriers, the Illustrious-class are arguably the most famous, and understandably so. These ships fought long and hard, and I've covered two of them before in HMS Formidable and HMS Victorious. In today's video, we'll be looking at another, the final member of the class, HMS Indomitable. Although she was more of a half-sister if anything. Not that it stopped the ship from surviving some pretty severe damage of her own, living up to her sisters there. Moreover, the ship would actually remain in service into the early 1950s. Indomitable might have even lasted a bit longer had it not been for an unfortunate accident late in her career. Then again, part of that half-sister thing would have made her more difficult to rebuild. Let's look at that real quick before moving on to what she did in service. HMS Indomitable was initially ordered as the fourth Illustrious-class ship. However, by this point, the Royal Navy had shifted a bit. They wanted a larger air group than the 36 or so aircraft that an Illustrious could carry, without being willing to move to a deck park in the American style. That meant a redesign of the ship. The British came to this decision in 1938, at which point only one of the sisters was early enough to modify. That ship was Indomitable, laid down in November of 1937. In order to increase the size of her air wing, the British elected for the simplest approach. Instead of a full redesign, they simply expanded the ship. Specifically, the flight deck was raised up by 14 feet, 4.3 meters, to allow for a second hangar to be fitted. That would increase the size of the air group to 48 aircraft, although it did come with some consequences. First, the side hangar protection had to be thinned down to 1.5 inches. Second, the original hangar, now the lower one, had to be shortened to just 168 feet or 51 meters. This was a twofold modification. First, that hangar could now only be serviced by the aft elevator. Second, the forward spaces were converted to machinery shops and storage to support the larger air wing. In addition to these changes, Indomitable also had a larger and stronger forward elevator fitted. Not directly related to the hangar changes, but still a difference worth noting. The same applies to her seakeeping, which saw a marked improvement due to being higher out of the water than her sisters. All of these changes did result in arguably the most capable armored carrier when she joined the fleet, but they also came with certain sacrifices. That 14-foot upper hangar was fine, at least when designed. However, later generations of aircraft, particularly American designs, didn't quite fit. This would be an issue later on. But when designed, Indomitable was a good compromise between speed of construction and improved capabilities over her sisters. Now, to wrap this section up, let's look at the details of that design. As built, Indomitable displaced around 23,000 tons at her standard loading. This rose up to 29,700 when fully loaded, according to Hobbs. By comparison, Illustrious was around 28,000, citing the same source. This displacement came on a length of 230 meters, 754 feet, and a beam of 29 meters, or 95 feet. The flight deck, for its part, was initially 207 meters, 680 feet long, although this was extended to 227 meters, 745 feet in a 1943 refit. The flight deck and the two hangars beneath it were designed to support 48 aircraft, With a deck park, this number rose to 56, right in line with her sister ships, which does more to demonstrate how useful a deck park can be than anything about the respective designs. That aside, for defensive purposes, Indomitable carried 8 twin 4.5-inch 114mm mounts, for 16 barrels in all, supported by a mix of 40mm pom-poms, 40mm Bofors, and 20mm cannon, with the ship protected by a 3-inch thick armored flight deck and a 1.5-inch thick hangar side, with a 4.5-inch thick main armor belt. With all of this pushed through the water at 30.5 knots by 111,000 shaft horsepower through 3 shafts. And that wraps up the background, which means we can finally move on to the service history, starting with the keel laying on November 10th, 1937. Indomitable would have a fast construction period after this point, as Vickers Armstrong showed no signs of slowing down for the ship's redesign. The carrier was launched on March 26, 1940, and commissioned on October 10, 1941. That was only a few months after Victorious, in spite of the redesign. A triumph of British shipbuilding, if there ever was one. Unfortunately, an early accident would render this fast construction a bit moot. While she was working up in the West Indies, the carrier ran aground on November 3, 1941. This didn't do much in the way of actual damage, but it did require some repair work, which is unfortunate because Indomitable was supposed to join Force Z in Singapore. She would have provided much needed air cover for Prince of Wales and Repulse, at least in theory. However, due to the accident, Indomitable was delayed. She only sailed to join the Eastern Fleet in December 1941, by which point Prince of Wales and Repulse were already on the bottom. I should say it is debatable how much good Indomitable could have done against overwhelming Japanese forces. Even if she had saved the capital ships from the first attack, one carrier was not going to change the ultimate result. Not when the Japanese brought the Kido Butai to bear. Still, the chance that Indomitable could have kept Prince of Wales and Repulse afloat is one of those great what-ifs of the Second World War. In any event, however, Indomitable would sail to Ceylon instead of Singapore, despite a brief detour to pick up 50 Hurricanes in Sudan for transfer. Indomitable picked those aircraft up in January 1942. By the time she reached the East Indies in late January, those aircraft were more necessary in Sumatra. So the Hurricanes were flown off on January 27, 1942, where they would mostly be destroyed on the ground and of little use to the British. And with the fall of Singapore in February, Indomitable was limited to the Indian Ocean. She would become one of 2 modern British carriers in the area, alongside her sister Formidable. HMS Hermes was there as well, but that ship was old and slow. By the time Hermes was sunk, she wasn't even carrying her 12 swordfish. As for Indomitable, she joined her sister in attempting to engage the Japanese when they launched the Indian Ocean raid in early April. Under Admiral James Somerville, the 2 carriers made several attempts. These included trying to find the Japanese at night, where radar could be used to guide in attackers. However, none of these attempts would result in anything. The British never quite found the Japanese carriers, and Indomitable would miss her one chance to engage the Kido Butai. Instead, she would withdraw to Bombay on April 8th, while the Japanese sank multiple British warships, from the aforementioned Hermes to HMS Dorsetshire. Indomitable, for her part, would sail away from India and on towards Africa. This came at the end of April, with the carrier departing on April 22nd to join another of her half-sisters in the form of Illustrious. The two carriers had been assigned to Operation Ironclad, the invasion of Madagascar on May 5, 1942. That island was under Vichy French rule, and the British would land troops as a preemptive action to keep the valuable island safe in Allied hands. One of several times that the Allies and Vichy French fought one another, although this is one of the more forgotten ones. It was also the first time Indomitable's pilots actually engaged an enemy directly, even if that enemy was once an ally. Specifically, they destroyed several French fighters in addition to various ground positions, with the planes flying 60 sorties on May 5th and May 6th. For her part, Indomitable was also attacked directly when a French submarine attempted a torpedo run. Fortunately for the carrier, her escorts, particularly HMS Active and HMS Panther, were on the ball. The French sub was sunk by their depth charges on May 8th. Soon after this failed attack, Indomitable departed Madagascar for more familiar waters, specifically the Mediterranean. She would arrive in Gibraltar in late July 1942 to prepare for a rather more famous operation. Indomitable would join 3 other British carriers off of Gibraltar: Victorious, Furious, and Eagle, not to launch airstrikes or support an invasion, but to cover a massive Malta convoy, aside from Furious, which would launch fighters to reinforce Malta's garrison. This was Operation Pedestal, setting out on August 9th. This would see very heavy attack from the Germans and Italians, airstrikes, submarines, and torpedo boats. Multiple ships were damaged, ranging from light to crippling damage. Several more would be sunk, including the venerable Eagle. Indomitable would not escape attention during this either. Her pilots contributed to downing around 30 enemy aircraft over the course of the attacks, but their ship could not escape damage of her own. On August 12, 1942, Indomitable would be hit by 2 bombs. There is some debate on the size of those bombs, commonly cited as 500 kilogram or 1,100 pound weapons. Armored Carriers, meanwhile, cites them as 250 kilogram or 550 pound bombs, based on a 14-inch hole in the deck which matched the diameter of the smaller weapon, along with shrapnel damage matching a 250 kilogram burster-type bomb. Regardless, the damage was severe. Since the first hit was in an unarmored part of the deck, the bomb penetrated and detonated inside the ship. The forward lift was bent upwards, and a 30-foot hole was blown between 3 decks. Most visually apparent was a hole blown in the side near one of her gun mounts. Meanwhile, the second hit would be further aft. This blew a large part of the deck away, although the damage wasn't crippling. Planes could still land once debris was cleared away. Several near misses contributed more damage, with the worst hitting near the port's stern. This caused severe flooding along 104 feet of the ship, creating, among other things, an 8-degree list. Indomitable was down, but she wasn't out. The crew continued to operate aircraft at limited capacity, and the carrier was able to return to Gibraltar under her own power. However, repairs for this damage kept the ship out of the war until February 1943. and post-refit trials kept Indomitable close to home until June 1943. As a result, Indomitable would not return to the Mediterranean until June, just in time to support the Operation Husky landings in Sicily in July 1943. Unfortunately, the ship was almost immediately damaged again upon her return to combat. An Italian torpedo bomber hit the ship on July 16th, forcing Indomitable back for repair, this time in the United States. These repairs lasted until April 1944 between the damage and an extensive refit. Indomitable was, as a result, out of the war for the second half of 1943 and the first half of 1944. It would be a bit longer still before she returned to combat. Indomitable was dispatched to the Eastern Fleet once again after picking up new aircraft in May. The carrier set sail for Ceylon in June 1944 and arrived on July 5th. Once there, she joined her sisters in raiding Japanese holdings, primarily striking facilities in the East Indies. This would continue from August 1944 through January 1945. In these strikes, Indomitable joined both Victorious and Illustrious at different points. In general, these raids were successful, and the Japanese, by now starting to falter, didn't manage to damage the carrier. That said, by January, Indomitable had shifted to the British Pacific Fleet. Rebased in Australia in February 1945, this fleet continued operations, now working with the American Pacific Fleet, primarily off Okinawa in March. Indomitable would arrive there on March 23rd, where she would be damaged by a kamikaze strike on April 1st, although in classic BPF style, "Well, man the sweepers" is a meme in the historical community for a reason. While Indomitable lost 14 men, the flight deck was clear within the hour. Indomitable would then continue airstrikes, including on Japan itself in late April, with these operations continuing into May despite suffering 2 more kamikaze strikes. None of these did severe enough damage to take her off the line, although the ship was apparently suffering from shaft issues that lowered her speed. More damage came in a collision with the destroyer Quilliam, but even this didn't take her out of service. In fact, Indomitable only left the theater in June when Implacable relieved her. She would be in refit in Australia after this point, remaining there until Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. Her war wasn't quite over, though, with the carrier striking Japanese kamikaze boats on August 31st and September 1st. After this, Indomitable returned to peace, going into reserve in 1947 for a 3-year refit running into 1950. Apparently, all that steaming had worn out her boilers because those were in need of replacement. Once the refit was done, Indomitable returned to service. She trained and performed other peacetime duties like patrols and port visits, with this duty lasting until 1953 when the carrier suffered an accident. On February 3rd, an internal explosion rocked the ship. That damage spelled her end. Indomitable would only perform a fleet review and experimental testing of mirror landing lights later that year. After this, she went into reserve in October 1953. The carrier would never be modernized. That would have required extending the height of the hangar, and with 2 hangars, that would be a lot of work. Tear her down to the waterline work And as I covered with Victorious, that is not cheap. So Indomitable would ultimately be sold for scrapping at the end of September 1955. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.